There we are. Okay. Get all set up here. And actually, Annie, if you could give me a hand here. Whoa. I'd like you to give everybody one of those. Okay, I'm going to put this as a disclaimer right up front. Do not poke yourself with this, and do not swallow it. Just to be safe. Basically, what I want you to do with it is hold on to it. This will come a little bit later, but I want to give it all out now. So, and I also wanted to be noted that I had 1 hour less to prepare for this sermon than any other week. So, if for some reason it doesn't go well, that's the reason why. Right. There was an old minister who was completing a sermon on temperance, or the evils of alcohol, if you want to say. And with great emphasis, as he was preaching, he's like, if I had all the beer in the world, I would take it and I would pour it in the river. And with the greater emphasis, he continued and said, if I had all the wine in the world, I would take it and I'd pour it in the river. Finally, great emphasis, he's shaking his fist as he's saying, if I had all the whiskey in the world, I'd take it and I'd pour it in the river. With that, his sermon complete, he goes and sits down. Worship leader gets up, cautiously goes up to the microphone and announces, for our closing song, let us sing hymn 365, Shall We Gather at the River? That had nothing to do with the sermon, but it was fun. So, we're going to continue in 2 Kings. Pastor Aaron's been preaching through 2 Kings, and it was rather interesting. He got to this point and probably would have been preaching where I'm preaching out of last week, but we, of course, got snowed out. And when I mentioned, I happen to have a sermon that fits right into that next chapter we're talking about. And he's, whoa, you got to preach it. Okay, so I'm going to preach it this week, and he's going to preach it next week. So I'm going to get it from two different angles, which is good. So one of the things I've always wanted to do is have, different preachers preaching the same passage, because God's going to show a different person different things. And they're going to get different things out of the passage. And I think that makes it come alive for the congregation. 2 Kings chapter 7 is where we're going to be. But first, a little bit of setup on what's going on in 2 Kings chapter 7. The end of 2 Kings 6 talks about what's happening in Samaria at the time. Samaria was in the midst of a severe famine because it was being under siege by the king of the Syrians. We're talking a famine so bad that a donkey's head was selling for 80 shekels of silver. Now, I know we don't deal in shekels, so that may not mean anything to you. What 80 shekels of silver was about 2 pounds. And if you were to take 2 pounds of silver at today's prices, that means a donkey's head was selling for $492.38. And the Bible tells us a quarter cab, which is 3/10 of a liter, of dove's dung sold for 5 shekels of silver. Now, I was reading some commentaries on dove's dung, and they were saying, that might be just a little, some seed pod or something like that, that's what they called. Or it could literally have been dove's dung. Who knows? I don't really know. It just doesn't sound very appetizing, whatever it is. Said it was selling for 5 shekels of silver, which is 2 ounces, which at today's prices would be $30.78. So we're talking very, very high prices here. Now, this sounds pretty disturbing and problematic as it is, but it gets even worse. Continues to talk about the king as he's walking along the walls and probably looking out and seeing where the enemy army is and looking to see the city. And as he's walking, a woman screams at him, says, "Please help me, my Lord King." And the king answers her, "Well, if the Lord doesn't help you, what can I do? I have neither food from the threshing floor nor wine from the press to give you." But the king then, says, "Well, what's the matter?" And the woman goes on to tell a story about another woman that came up to her and said, "Come on, let's eat your son today, and tomorrow we'll eat my son." And the woman continues and says, "So we cooked my son that day. And the next day, when I went to the woman to say, 'Okay, let's do your son,' she had taken her son and hid him away." So we're talking very disturbing things. I mean, can you imagine a mother saying, "Sure, let's cook my kid"? I mean, would any mother here even consider that? I mean, how hungry would you have to be? I mean, I'm a father, and I can't think of any reason why I would ever do that. The thing about it is her today. So we're in a very bad spot here, is what I'm essentially trying to say, what I'm trying to describe. And at this point, the king is just disturbed. He rips his robes, and underneath he's got sackcloth and ashes, or sackcloth on. And the king then turns and threatens the prophet and says, "May God strike me and even kill me if I do not separate Elijah's head from his shoulders this very day." So this is where we're at when we get into 2 Kings chapter 7. 2 Kings 7 starts out, "Elisha replied, 'Hear the word of the Lord. This is what the Lord says. About this time tomorrow, a seah of finest flour will sell for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel at the gate of Samaria.' The officer on whose arm the king was leaning said to the man of God, 'Look, even if the Lord should open the floodgates of heaven, could this happen?' Elisha said to him, 'You will see it with your own eyes, but you will not eat any of it.' Now there were 4 men with leprosy at the entrance of the city gate. They said to each other, 'Why stay here until we die?'" I'm going to pause right there. And what I want to focus on is the statement there at the very end by the 4 lepers. It's where I'm going to take the title from my sermon today. And I'm actually taking it out of the King James because I like how the King James phrases it. It's simply titled, "Why Sit We Here Until We Die?" A lot of people treat church as something they just go to once a week. Come to on Sunday, you're there for an hour, maybe 2 hours, depending on how your church services run. You go, you sing some songs, you listen to somebody speak, you go. You go out beyond, and the rest of the time, you just go out among your normal business. Church doesn't actually affect anything beyond the hour or 2 you spend on Sunday. You walk off, you feel good. "Oh, I did my duty this week. I went to church, I prayed, I sang, I listened to some preaching. I'm all good." People come in and they'll sit, and that's all they'll do. They don't do anything besides sitting. They're waiting. There's a lot of time, and I remember growing up, everyone was, looking forward to the return of Jesus. I'm just waiting until Jesus comes. And that's how sometimes we get. We get in here and we sit down and we're saved, we're sitting, we're waiting until Jesus comes. Please, Lord, come take us out of here. We don't want to do anything else. We sit there until either, Jesus comes, or we literally die, or you could spiritually die. The thing about it is I don't see that as the church Jesus is coming back for. We're looking forward to the return of Jesus. We keep talking about it, and as we see the things in the world getting worse and worse, and we're like, oh, please come quickly, get us out of here. The thing about it is when it's the darkest, that's when we need to be there out working, out doing something, not sitting in church. We need to be out there among the people. Seem to have this idea that we're saved, and that's it. That's all there is to it. We don't need to we don't need to do anything. We don't need to talk to anybody else. I was reading a book by a man named Mark Batterson. It's called All In. And he made a statement in there. He says, Jesus did not die for us to be safe. He died for us to be dangerous. In other words, he didn't die for us just to come in, get saved, and sit in the church building. He died for us to actually go out and take it to a world that needs it. Got me to thinking, why do we do that? Why do we sit? Why do we just come in? Why do we sit? And I think there's different periods in our lives. Sometimes, there are some people that will literally come in and that's all they do. They're going to come in, they're going to sit in church, they're going to go out. It's not going to affect anything else in their lives. I do also think there may be periods in our lives that we go through cycles to where maybe that's all we're doing. There were times growing up, I grew up in church. I could look the part, act the part, talk the part, but be nowhere near the part. I could do everything to look Christian, but in my heart, I wasn't. In my heart, I was coming to church, I was sitting, that was it. It wasn't affecting anything else in my life. So I was thinking about it, it's like, well, what gets us to where we might just sit, where church doesn't become, just becomes a thing we do? A couple things came to mind. I'm sure there's many, many more than what I'm going to cover today. I think number one, we allow ourselves to get distracted. We allow ourselves to get distracted by things going on around us. We allow ourselves to get distracted by religion, which may sound a little funny because you're thinking, well, isn't that what we're, No, hopefully we're the furthest thing from religious. When I'm talking religion, I'm talking about things to where we're, dealing with rules and regulations and trying to make it to where we're, micromanaging everybody. In Luke, Jesus tells a parable about a Pharisee and a tax collector. And as he's talking, they're going to pray, and they're walking into the temple. And you see two different reactions on what happens. The tax collector comes in there, and he falls down on his face. The Pharisee is standing, and we hear the Pharisee's prayer as he's talking about, Lord, thank you that I am not like this lowly tax collector, that I am so great that I, do all this stuff for you, that I pray daily, I follow the law strictly, I do all this stuff, whereas we go to the tax collector, and he's on his face going, Lord, help me, a poor sinner. I think we should be striving to be more like that tax collector, to be somebody who's on there, knowing that we need God, that we haven't arrived, that we're not perfect or anything like that, that we need more, that we need God's mercy, we need God's grace. Other things that can distract us, work. Now, I realize there are people that do have to work on Sundays. We actually have a couple of people that do that. Danny, usually is working every other Sunday. We got another one working every other Sunday. I mean, there are times when you're going to have to work. I'm talking about people that use work that basically they work to live. They live to work. Got that backwards. That's all they do is work. Work gets in the way of everything. It's like they, don't spend time with their family. They don't spend time at church because they're too busy working. Sometimes it's family. Family is very important. You need to spend time with your family, but sometimes family can get in the relationship with Jesus Christ. And this is one that sounds funny to us today because we don't think about idolatry as something that we have a problem with. Yes, Al, I'm about to get to that. But there are things that we put and make important in our lives that doesn't need to be there. Spend a lot of time television, movies. I put that on there because that's something I struggle with. I love sitting there. I can binge watch all kinds of things. Love it. Love going to the movies. Love watching movies. But you got to make sure that there's a balance to it, that it doesn't become the overriding thing that I'm doing in my life. I put on here cars. I'm not really a car person, never have been. Maybe in this church it should be more like mopeds. Or sports. People get so fanatical about that. And believe me, I was there at one point where, it was, if my team lost, it ruined my day. Grand scheme of things. But people get to where it consumes their lives. Another thing. People that just hold on to it. And it becomes something that starts to consume them. Everything that happens in their lives, they're seeing through the lens of that hurt. And it starts to take over. I've seen people, dealt with people that's what they're doing. Everything happens through that lens of whatever that hurt is. They just can't either forgive, feel like they can be forgiven, or just let it go. And I know it's not the easiest thing to do. It's not easy to let go sometimes those hurts and stuff like that. But it can be something that can distract us from what we need to be doing. I don't know if anyone here, I think everyone might be married or not, well, except for me, a few other people, but the opposite sex can be distracting. The Bible tells the story of Samson and Delilah. Samson was born for a purpose. Can you imagine what Samson could have done if he wouldn't have allowed the distraction of Delilah? If he would have just kept on where he was supposed to. He knew what he was supposed to do, but there was this girl. I think the other thing, big thing that can sometimes hinder us and make us sit, not do what we should be doing, not working for the kingdom, is that sometimes we feel insignificant. We feel like, why would God use me? Why would God want me? Why would God save me? I'm nothing, I'm nobody. Maybe you're sitting out there going, you know what, I'll never be able to preach like Larry does. You're right. Thing about it is, I realized this, is you're always looking at a lot of times you're looking at somebody and like, I'll never be like that person. The one thing to understand is that person is looking at somebody else going, I'm never going to be like that person. Because there'll be times I'm sitting there, I'm listening to somebody preach. I listen to like Francis Chan and go, I'll never be able to preach like that. Here's the thing about it. God didn't call you to be like me. God didn't call me to be like Francis Chan. I'm not supposed to preach like him. I'm supposed to preach like me. You're supposed to do what God wants you to do. And the thing about it is God uses people that might be looked at as insignificant in the world. God uses insignificant things. I mean, think about it. One of the greatest miracles that we have in the Bible is when, the feeding of the 5,000. What did he have? 5 loaves and 2 fishes. The disciples are even going, what is this among so many? And when it talks about the 5,000, that's just counting the men. That's not counting the women and children. And Jesus, they take that insignificant 5 loaves and 2 fishes and feed everybody. And the Bible tells us they were taking extras. They had more than enough. Jesus was able to take something insignificant and do great things with it. You can look, we actually talked about this, was brought up in Bible study. A man that's really mentioned only one time. We only hear about him one time, aside from Paul mentioning him in passing when he's doing his testimony. It's a man named Ananias. Ananias is the man that after Paul is struck down on the road to Damascus, and he's in Damascus, God appears to Ananias in a vision and says, I need you to go and pray for Saul. Can you imagine how that conversation must have went? Ananias is there. You're talking about Saul, who has, been terrorizing and persecuting Christians, putting them to death. He's coming to Damascus. That was the whole purpose of him coming to Damascus, was to find Christians and arrest them and put them to death. And now God is telling Ananias, hey, I need you to go talk to that guy. Can you imagine Ananias go, say what, God? Do you know what that guy does? You know what the guy is here for? But thank God that Ananias didn't back down. Ananias went. Ananias talked to Paul, or Saul at the time, prayed for him, and we see what happened. Saul, who is called Paul in the Bible, goes on to write like 14 books that we have in our Bible now. Goes on to preach before kings and world leaders. Goes on to preach to the Jews, to the Gentiles. Many, many people come to Christ under his ministry because an insignificant person, or somebody who may have felt insignificant, or, history may look at as insignificant, answered the call. So why sit we here until we die? Let's go on and continue the story. When we last left our lepers, they were sitting, asking the question, why are we sitting here? Why sit we here until we die? Talks amongst each other. So if we stay here, we're going to starve. If we go into the city, the famine's there as well. And we're going to die. If we go to the enemy, well, they may kill us, but you know what? At least it's done quickly. It's done and over. We're not going to starve to death slowly. So why sit here? And the thing about it here is you can't really get more insignificant than 4 lepers. In that day and age, if you were a leper, you were an outcast. You weren't allowed to live in the city. If you actually did go into the city, you had to cover yourself up and you had to go through town yelling, unclean, unclean, so no one would get near you. So pretty insignificant. So they make this decision, is we're going. What's the worst that can happen? The worst that can happen is they kill us. Well, you know what? We're going to die anyways if we sit here. So they get up. It says at twilight, they got up and started heading towards the Syrian camp. In verse 5, it continues in chapter 7, verse 5. At dusk, they got up and went to the camp of the Armenians, which is the Syrians. When they reached the edge of the camp, no one was there. For the Lord had caused the Syrians to hear the sound of chariots and horses and a great army, so that they said to one another, "Look, the king of Israel has hired the Hittites and the Egyptian kings to attack us." So they got up and fled in the dusk and abandoned their tents and their horses and donkeys. They left the camps as it was and ran for their lives. The men who had leprosy reached the edge of the camp, entered one of the tents, and ate and drank. Then they took silver, gold, and clothes and went off and hid them. They returned and entered another tent, took some things from it and hid them also. Then they said to each other, what we are doing is not right. This is a day of good news, and we are keeping it to ourselves. If we wait until daylight, punishment will overtake us. Let's go at once and report this to the royal palace. So they went and called out to the city gatekeepers and told them, "We went into the Syrian camp, and no one was there. Not a sound of anyone, only tethered horses and donkeys and the tents left as they were." The gatekeeper shouted the news, and it was reported within the palace. The king got up in the night and said to his officers, "I will tell you what the Syrians have done to us. They know we are starving, so they've left the camp to hide in the country, thinking they will surely come out, and then we will take them alive and get into the city." One of his officers answered, "Have some men take 5 horses that are left in the city. Their plight will be that of all the Israelites left here. Yes, they will only be like all the Israelites who are doomed, so let's send them to find out what happened." So they selected 2 chariots and their horses, and the king sent them after the Syrian army. He commanded the drivers, "Go and find out what had happened." They followed them as far as the Jordan, and they found the whole road strewn with the clothing and equipment the Syrians had thrown away in their headlong flight. So the messengers returned and reported to the king. Then the people went out and plundered the camp of the Syrians. So a seah of the finest flour sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley sold for a shekel, as the Lord had said. Now the king had put the officer on whose arm he leaned in charge of the gate, and the people trampled him in the gate, and he died, just as the man of God had foretold when the king came down to the house. So we look here, like I said, you can't get more insignificant. But God used those 4 lepers to bring about a great victory. What happens if those lepers would have decided, you know what, we're just going to sit here. We're not going anywhere. No one else was going anywhere. Everyone in the city was sitting. They weren't going to move. They weren't budging. But because someone decided, you know what, I'm going to get up. I'm not going to just sit here until I die. I'm going to go and see. God was able to bring a great victory. Can you imagine if we just decide, you know what, we're not going to sit around. We're not going to wait. We're going to go out. We are going to meet people where they are. We're going to talk to them. We're going to, find out what their needs are and bring them the love of God. Meet them at the point of their needs. At this point, if you can get your nail, if you still got it, assuming you haven't poked yourself or swallowed it. What you have here is what's known as a horseshoe nail. It's not a very big thing, doesn't look very significant. I mean, it does exactly what it says. It holds a horseshoe on. The reason why I got horseshoe nails, because there's a poem. It's called "For Want of a Nail." What the poem is used is to demonstrate what is known as the butterfly effect. I think most people have probably heard of the butterfly effect. they've made movies and, stuff like that called The Butterfly Effect. I've never seen it, but because it didn't sound that good. But the poem goes like this: is for want of a nail. For want of a nail, the shoe was lost. For want of a shoe, the horse was lost. For want of a horse, the rider was lost. For want of a rider, the message was lost. For want of a message, the battle was lost. For want of a battle, the kingdom was lost. And all for the want of a horseshoe nail. Very insignificant thing. But in that poem, because they didn't have one of these, everything was lost. All for something that you would look at and be insignificant. There's actually, just looking at an example in my life, I install fire and security systems, and we have wire connectors, that these little plastic things that have little metal inserts, and you stick them on there and you crimp them down, and it keeps the wire together. And usually I've got, whole pockets full of these things. And you'll go, and there'll be times that they'll drop, and you just don't even think about it. Say, I'm not going to bend down and pick that up. It's just a little, wire connector. Then comes the one time you're there trying to get something done, and you need one wire connector. And you have none. And you're searching through everything to see if one just fell somewhere. And would do almost anything just because I just need that wire connector. The thing about it is we may feel at times that we're insignificant, that God may not be able to use us. Why would God want to use us? Why would God want to save us? Why would God die for us? The reason why I got the nail and wanted to give everybody one is because, hopefully you hang on to it. And if there might be a time that you're feeling insignificant, hopefully this shows up and reminds you that you're not, that there is a purpose. God has a purpose for you and for your life. God has a ministry for you. God has something for you to do. There is no reason to just sit on the sidelines and do nothing. And as we wrap this up and the worship team comes up, I just want to encourage you, remember that. Don't ever forget that. God loves you. God died for you. And he has a plan for you. He has something for you to do.